All right. Since I just figured out that we didn't have a voiceover for chapter 5, I'm just going to quick give us a little small, maybe an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 10-minute voiceover so you guys can watch this instead of the in video or in-person lectures. So let's discuss chapter 5, which is the integumentary system. A couple things to understand is that in terms of the overview of functions, these are all the functions you will need to know for the test, but in more detail. So this just kind of lists them. We'll talk about each one independently coming up in a few minutes. When we look at the integumentary system, one of the things you have to remember is it's not just the epidermis, right? So integumentary system includes the actual epidermis, which is the superficial part made out of stratified squamous cells. Then a second layer deep to that, that's where the blood vessels lie. That's where most of the glands that allows you to lubricate the hairs on your body, as well as glands that allows you to cool, right? Allows that to be formed and then released either onto the surface of your epidermis or onto the hair shafts. And then it follows the hair all the way up and then gets released into the surface of the epidermis. So we'll talk about what is the difference between the skin, the integumentary system, and the epidermis. So these are slightly different things, but they all relate to each other. And we'll talk about some of these differences coming up. So in terms of skin, skin is the part of your integumentary system that includes the epidermis and dermis only. When we add the last part, then we have this subcutaneous tissue, which is much deeper. That's this way in the back, way deep inside. And that is called the subcutaneous tissue, otherwise known as the hypodermis. So there's a couple words we use for this. So if you've ever had to give yourself a shot of Imitrex, some kind of shot, and even insulin, if you have somebody you know that has type 2 diabetes, well, those are just sub-Q injections. So the needle there are pretty short. And the main focus is to bring blood, not bring blood, but bring the medicine past these smaller blood vessels into the blood vessels of larger caliber. So then you can absorb it easier and faster. Now, the subcutaneous tissue we'll talk about is not part of the skin, but is part of the integumentary system. When we talk specifically about skin, it only includes dermis and epidermis. And we'll talk about each one coming up. So the epidermis. The epidermis is made out of stratified squamous cells here. The stratified squamous cells, when it's found in the skin or as part of the epidermis, as part of the integumentary system, the epidermis is what it's called when it's found in those regions. So again, it is stratified squamous cells, but when we find it on the surface of the skin, we call those stratified squamous cells the epidermis. The epidermis, like all epithelial tissue, is avascular. They receive their nutrients, their oxygen. They receive their glucose from blood vessels that lies slightly deep to the epidermis. So those blood vessels are called the dermal blood vessels. And what we're going to see is that the layers of skin, the layers of the epidermis closest to the blood vessels will obviously receive the most nutrients. It's the area that's closest. So as cells migrate upwards, they move further and further away from the blood vessel, and they start to then die off. So make sure that you can understand that there are no blood vessels in the epidermis, but there are blood vessels slightly deep to it. And those blood vessels that are immediately deep to the actual epidermal layer right here, well, those blood vessels allow us to have diffusion of gases and diffusion of glucose from inside the capillary in the bloodstream. Then it goes through the walls of the capillary, and then it has to be pushed into the basement membrane. And then the layer of cell closest to this junction between the dermis and the epidermis, those layer cells will receive the most nutrients because it is the closest. Now, composed of cells are arranged into layers or strata. So it's just a fancy name of saying layers is stratification or strata. Then you have something called the basement membrane that allows us to separate the dermis underneath and the epidermis above it and superficial to it. Now, what do we call cells individually then? So when we look at this right here, the whole layer is made out of stratified squamous cells. And since these stratified squamous cells are found in the skin, in the integumentary system, those stratified squamous cells change names, and we call it now the epidermis. Now, we can't call each one of these cells a stratified squamous cell, right? Because if we look at it individually, it's just one squamous cell. That's it, right? So what do we call each of these cells then? We call each of these cells keratinocytes. So there's a slight subtlety between these, right? The keratinocytes is a name when we look at one cell, and then its neighboring cell is also a keratinocyte. And then the next cell is also a keratinocyte. So all these cells that make up our epidermis, each of the individual cells is called a keratinocyte. When we look at it in its totality, we call it stratified squamous epithelium. And when you see that kind of epithelium on the surface of the skin, then we change the name to the epidermis. Now take a look at this undulation, kind of the dermis pushing upwards into the epidermal layer. It's not flat, in other words. There's up and down movements right here. That up and down movements gives us a couple things, right? It allows us to then have a little bit more space for blood vessels as close to the epidermis as possible. And we're going to see later on, this is also the basis of fingerprints. Again, epidermal cells, what are they? There's going to be a few types you're going to need to know. Keratinocytes, melanocytes, Langerhans cells, Merkel cells. Keratinocytes, well, this is the name of we just mentioned, right? That's the name we give for each of the cells that make up your stratified squamous epithelium. You're going to have hundreds of millions of these cells. Each of those cells is called a keratinocytes. Now, we'll come back to melanocytes in a second. Langerhans cells are important because it's part of the immune system. This is what keeps a nice, normal, healthy bacterial flora on our skin. If something happens to these Langerhans cells, you'll have more likelihood of infections from things that kind of seed in there that's worse than normal. You guys have heard of people having, right, flesh-eating type of bugs, right? It's still a pretty common bug, but in some people, right, the flesh-eating bacterium somehow overwhelms the Langerhans cells. And then it starts becoming necrotic tissue, and God forbid, sometimes they have to even amputate. So the Langerhans cells are white blood cells. The main job is to make sure that you're keeping a healthy, normal bacterial flora. So then the non-healthy, dangerous bacterium have no room to seed on your skin. Now the Merkel cells right here, they detect light touch. They are superficial in terms of they're able to interpret superficial pressure. So somebody's just kind of like, rubbing on your skin, right? Scratching a little bit. That's Merkel cells' job, is to receive that message that you're having some kind of light touch, and then be able to send an action potential to the brain eventually, so then you can actually sense that sensation. Now, melanocytes, pretty cool, right? Melanocytes produce melanin in response to activated ultraviolet light. Now, right, what we're going to see is this. There's a reason why people that are living close to the equator all have very similar skin color, all have very similar hair types. What do I mean? If you see populations in South Africa, or even throughout the African continent, and then you compare the population and you compare it to, right, people that live right next to the equator in India, and then people who live right next to the equator in Papua New Guinea, and the Australian Aborigines, they all look very similar in that They all have very dark skin. They also have very coarse, tough, black hair as well on the top of the scalp. And the reason why is because they live next to the equator. And if you think about it, right, up until pretty recently, we didn't have sunscreen. Sunscreen is pretty recent advent, right, invention. So what would happen if you are living in the sub-equator, equator region where there's sun almost 365 days a year, and then specifically in the summers, it gets really intense sunlight. What happens if you don't have sunscreen, don't have clothes that would block sunscreen, and your skin was slightly light-skinned, right? You're Caucasian and you're living in that situation where it's hot all the time. There's no sunscreen, so you don't have the protection from chemistry. So what would normally happen then is people that would be fair skinned would have a lot of sunburns, right? So you would have sunburns, any kind of mole or any kind of freckle you might have might start to change into malignant melanoma. The more often you have exposure to sunlight, intense sunlight, the more often you have sunburns, the greater the risk of getting some kind of malignant melanoma. So that would not be good. So it kind of makes sense why when we compare population groups, even when we look at the forests, right, in Brazil, when we look at the forests in Colombia, you will see populations that also have super dark skin and have very dark, coarse hair. Now, the dark skin, to prevent any kind of burns, to make it less likelihood that you will have burns and an eventual type of cancers. And again, this nowadays we are protected by, right, sunscreen. We can wear clothes that are ultraviolet resistant, but even 100 years ago, that was not the case. So if you live in those situations, you want to have darker skin. So then you have equal or even greater protection from the sunlight. What else? The hair color. In terms of the hair color and the hairstyle, right? And the hair pattern, what you're going to see is that you have very short curly hair in all of those different population group. So if you have a chance, I want you to look up the natives of Papua New Guinea, look up the Australian Aborigines, right? And their hair should look very similar to the populations we see in Africa. Why? Again, right? Our scalp is made out of skin. It can burn. And if you have lighter skin and you have lighter hair color, 100 years ago, you're going to have a hard time protecting your scalp from being burned. So what happens? The melanocytes in those areas start to release more and more and more melanin. And that melanization occurs due to a combination of ancestry and location next to the equator or away from the equator. The darker you are, the more protection you have closer to that equatorial region. And that's why you see those population groups having similar colored hair and similar color pattern of hair and similar types of skin color as well, right? Now, what's also true is this. If you're light skin, if you're like me, kind of medium complexion, or if you've got dark skin, you can still get sunburns if you do not protect yourself. You can still tan too. So let's say you're working out. It's in the middle of summer. You're working out in a garden. You have a t-shirt on. The t-shirt kind of blocks the ultraviolet radiation. But since it's a short sleeve t-shirt, because it's hot, then the areas that's not protected by your t-shirt will receive excess amount of UV radiation. That causes the melanocytes there to release more and more melanin. The melanin, once it gets released, is picked up by all of those keratinocytes, causing the area that's exposed to then be darker than the area that's unexposed. So what happens then? You have that exposure on your arm all the way down, and your arms get darker, while the areas where you have clothing, then those areas have blocked away the UV sunlight. So those areas, then you have less sunlight, less exposure, less melanocyte release of melanin. And then you have a farmer's tan, right? Now, what would happen then if for the next 3-4 weeks, even next 3-4 months, right? You've already gotten a nice tan. What happens if during the winter, you're no longer exposed to sunlight? You have a jacket on, you have a sweatshirt on, sometimes both, and you're no longer outside as long, exposing your skin to this ultraviolet radiation. Well, what happens is, remember, right? There's a process that allows us to remove old skin cells. We call that process desquamation. All right, desquamation or desquamate right here is the movement of cells as it gets pushed from deeper regions to then gets pushed upwards towards the surface. What do we mean? So let's take a look right here and we'll discuss desquamation right here. Now, that bottom layer. So I'm going to go and discuss this slide because it's easier to kind of discuss this as we're going through a picture. So this is a superficial layer closest to the environment. This is the deeper layer close to the dermis underneath. So what do we see is that you have this bottom layer, the deepest layer of your epidermis. This is the only truly functionally mitotic cells in the actual skin right here. So the book will talk about maybe you have a little bit of mitotic activity here, but we know that there's the most amount of mitosis occurring in the stratum basale. So what happens with the stratum basale is this. When we have mitosis, right? Remember, if you get a cut, a lot of these cells will be cut away. So you will need to replace those cells. As long as this bottom layer of cells are still present, the cells we call the stratum basale cells, as long as those cells are still present, you can heal without having any kind of stitches, without having any kind of scarring. So what happens, right? You get a cut and all these layers have been cut away, leaving only this bottom layer of the stratum basale. Well, the stratum basale then undergoes mitosis. As it undergoes mitosis, it forms two cells. One of those cells stays a stem cell, right? It stays attached to the basement membrane. The other one gets pushed up and turns into the cells of the stratum spinosum, right? Then you need more cells. The cells of the stratum basale will then undergo mitosis again. One cell stays a stem cell, and then one becomes another cell of the stratum spinosum, right? So this new cell pushes the one previously up a level. And then stratum basale cells undergo mitosis again, reproduces, and then one stays a stem cell. The other one, right, is then going to be moved into the stratum spinosum, pushing the older and the oldest one up another level. That process where it's almost like an escalator, where the new cells pushes the old cells up towards the surface. That is what the process we call desquamation. So all of these cells in the stratum corneum were originally cells that were formed by the stratum basale, right? And then because the stratum basale keeps producing cells, it keeps pushing older cells to the surface. Eventually you get so far away from the basement membrane, from the blood vessel deep to it, the cells get so far away, it doesn't receive any nutrients, and then they will die off. Now, as that desquamation happens, remember, coming back to our tan, right? If you have that tan from the summer and then the winter, you start losing your tan because you're no longer exposing your skin to ultraviolet radiation. You get lighter skin. Why? Well, because of desquamation, any of the old cells that had picked up lots of melanin in the summer, well, those cells start to migrate and get moved up close to the surface. As it moves up to the surface, you will then exfoliate those darker color cells away. Since the new cells have never gotten exposed to ultraviolet radiation, they don't have as much melanin to pick up, right? So the new cells will look lighter in coloration, and then you lose your tan as a response. So just, it's kind of interesting talking about the melanization. Remember, areas exposed to ultraviolet radiation will produce more melanin. You don't produce more melanocytes, you produce more melanin. We all have about the same amount of melanocytes. It is the fact that because of inheritance pattern from many, 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 many generations of our ancestry, because of local factors as well, where you live now, right? You might have different colored skin. If your ancestors were living in the sub-Saharan Africa, were living in Papua New Guinea, in Indonesia, where I am, in India, well, guess what? You normally have darker skin, right? Why? Well, those melanocytes are a little bit more active than people that are moving or that live further away from the equator. Right? In terms of the epidermal stratum, the bottom layer is called the stratum basale. This is the only functionally active cells for repair and growth during normal situations. Now, if you get a big cut, you can have the second layer become more, can also undergo limited cellular division. So you look at the stratum spinosum right here, right? If you get a cut, a scrape, right, and it doesn't go all the way through here, doesn't cut all the way into the dermis, it's very superficial laceration. What happens is now there's a lot of room up here if you cut all these layers away. The stratum spinosum cell no longer have what we call contact inhibition, right? They're not just pushed together so tight that there's no room. That contact inhibition will normally stop these stratum spinosum cells from undergoing mitosis. But if all these cells are dead up here because of a big scrape, right? What happened is these cells now have room and they can undergo mitosis to reproduce these other layers. That's what we mean by limited cellular division. It can produce itself by mitosis, but not normally, and it can only do so if there is some kind of cut or laceration above it. The third layer is when the cell starts to die, stratum granulosum, right? When the stratum granulosum, the cells that are closer to the stratum spinosum still have a slightly functional nucleus. By the time it migrates upwards and desquamate right here, the cells that are closer to the surface have already lost the nucleus here. If you take a look, as these cells migrate up, you see what looks like yellow lipids that are lipid droplets starts to be released from these cells. And you can see more and more yellowing of the fat right there. And that yellowing right here, this fatty release allows us to waterproof skin. So then we don't lose, water insensibly. So it also helps prevent so that our cells here don't have osmosis. And when you're swimming, right, cells doesn't just, receive lots and lots and lots of water, and it causes your cells to swell up. So the actual fats, the lipids that's found between your cells allows for the waterproofing to prevent water loss and to prevent water gain, right? You don't want to just go in a bathtub, take a 30-minute bath so you can relax. And then when you get out, you swell out everywhere, right? Your skin just becomes soaked with water, right? And then the cells become enlarged. You don't want that to happen. And we don't see it happen. Why? Because we have that fat that protects and prevents water from entering our epidermal cells. Right now, the last one right here, the fourth one, is only found in a region we call areas of thick skin. Thick skin contains this fourth layer called the stratum lucidum, right? All of the other skin, thick and thin, will have these other layers. They will all have stratum basale, all have a pretty thick stratum spinosum, all will have stratum granulosum, all will also have stratum corneum layers, right? So even thick and thin skin will have those four layers. Now, what sets thick skin apart from thin skin is this layer called the stratum lucidum. So there is an extra layer of skin when we compare thick skin, where you see the presence of the stratum lucidum, and thin skin, where there's an absence of this layer, right? Now, what else are we going to see, right? In a couple minutes, I'm going to talk about thick and thin skin. So go back to it. And again, I'm going to look at it in terms of visualizing it on a picture. But what I'm going to talk about next is actually found about 2 slides away. And what I'm talking about next is what is the difference between thick and thin skin, right? Thick skin contains this stratum lucidum, thin skin doesn't. Now, the weird thing is this, thick skin being thicker, you'd think would have less sensitivity. And that's not true. What we are going to see is that thick skin, even with these extra layer of stratum lucidum, thick skin has more Merkel's disc, it's going to have more pain receptors. And what we're going to see is that even though it's thicker, it's actually more sensitive to pain, to pressure, to touch. And it kind of makes sense, right? Why? Thick skin is found on your fingertips. Thick skin is found on the palms of your hand. Thick skin is found on your toes and the sole of your foot, right? Those areas, especially with the fingertips, is how we manipulate the environment. So then if we have thick skin, we'll have more protection. But because thick skin is also more sensitive, you'll have greater sensitivity to touch. So you can touch and feel differences in texture. This is the reason how people who are blind can feel the patterns of bumps, right? And they can use a patterning of bumps so then they can read Braille, all because of the thick skin having increased sensitivity. You can feel whether the bumps are 3 bumps in a row, or maybe 2 bumps in a row and then a space and then a bump, right? It's all going to be felt by the fingertips where you have greater sensitivity. Now, if you have family members with diabetes, type 1 or type 2, doesn't matter, they have to check their blood glucose a lot. And with thick skin, usually they, poke themselves in the fingertips, and then the fingertips start scarring and starts becoming more and more painful. Becomes more and more painful because thick skin is more sensitive. Now, there are some, I wouldn't say newer, but compared to the older glucosimeters, right? There's the new ones where you can actually get some of the blood from your forearm. And since your forearm has thin skin, there's less sensitivity and you don't feel the pain as much. Most of you guys have probably bumped into something, didn't realize how hard you bump into it. The next day, right? You look in the mirror and your shoulder's all bruised up. What happened? Well, you bump into something, but because the rest of your body, right? Everywhere else, except for your fingertips, palms, soles of your foot, everywhere else, we have thin skin. And with thin skin, there's less sensitivity. So if you bump something, right? Unless you really have pain in it, you usually don't even realize it. Why? 1, right? Because there's less sensitivity. You might not feel that pain to the same extent. And 2, because there's decreased sensitivity, you don't notice it. And you only notice it when you look in the mirror. Now, the last thing we'll talk about in terms of the epidermis is the calluses that forms. Now, if you work out, I know I work out a lot, so we're starting to see a lot of what we call resolutioners, right? People who start January 1st and say they want to get in shape. So what happens when people want to get in shape is they start working out a lot, at least within the first month, and it slowly tapers off. But when you first start working out, if you're doing weights, you'll eventually form calluses on your hands, on your fingertips even. The calluses is caused by the increased number of cells in the stratum corneum. Now think about what happens, let's say if you're doing some kind of pull down exercises, lat pull downs, right? The machine where you kind of move your arm downwards and you're working on your lower back, your latissimus dorsi. Well, what's going to happen is with increased friction, because you're holding onto the bar, that bar as you're holding onto it has weights attached to it. So there's a lot of stress on your hands and your fingers. What happens is it causes premature death of these cells as they migrate up, right? More and more cells start to die, causing the stratum corneum to increase in size. As the stratum corneum increases in size, there are more layers of the stratum corneum. And guess what? More layers means it becomes tougher and more callousy. Now, what happens if you stop working out for a couple of weeks? What happens is you no longer have that gripping of that bar under tension. Less and less cells die off so early, and the stratum corneum layer normalizes. And now your callus can go away. So that's what callus formation is, right? And here, in terms of skin color, you can see how the melanocytes right here will release melanin as part, right? Right here, it releases melanin, which then gets picked up by each of the keratinocytes, allowing us to darken the region that's exposed. Now let's imagine, you're outside, you have a t-shirt on as in the middle of summer, and then you have your Apple Watch on, right? What happens is the Apple Watch is big, it's thick, it blocks the ultraviolet radiation, so then you don't expose your wrist to that sunlight. The melanocytes there don't release as much melanin. So that area that got blocked from direct sunlight will not darken. And it looks like right? It looks light in coloration. And now you have what looks like this white coloration, the shape of your iWatch. Now, there are people who, for some reason or another, they have melanocytes, but the melanocytes don't release melanin that's actually functional, right? And those people are true albinos. So people that are true albinos, and I think I should have something right here, albinism, right? It's a deficiency or absence of pigment. Now, true albinos are born with it, and every single region where they should have pigment, they're lacking. So the hair lacks pigment, so it's completely white. The skin lacks pigment, right? Any melanin. So even if they're exposed to ultraviolet radiation, they can't release melanin. So they will burn incredibly easily, right? The risk of people that are albinos, the risk of some kind of cancer is huge. What else is different is this. Even the iris of their eyes have a lack of melanin. So if you look in their eyes, the eyes might look a little reddish. And what we're seeing is not that there's kind of red pigment there. No, what we're seeing in people that have true albino, that have true albinism, is the blood vessels found in the iris, right? Because there's a lack of melanin right there, we can see past part of the iris and into the blood vessels, and the red blood cells coursing through, and it appears red in color. Now, in terms of albinism, there is one that is someone that's truly an albino is born with the actual traits. But there are people that have something called vitiligo. Vitiligo is an autoimmune disease. And as an autoimmune disease, the melanocytes are killed off by our body's own antibodies. And for some reason or another, right, it usually starts in the fingers, starts on the palms. And as you lose those melanocytes, you lose the ability to protect your skin from ultraviolet radiation. So the areas where, like I mentioned, right, they are going to kind of look, and it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in spots. So there are regions then where it's lighter coloration than other regions. Those regions that are lighter in coloration have no melanocytes in there. So if you expose, let's say the top of your hand, if you expose that top of your hand to sunlight for even 10 minutes, right? The people that have vitiligo, the people that have true albinism, right? They will burn in just a few minutes. You expose that sunlight without any kind of sunscreen, right? Now, the next things we're going to talk about are skin color. In terms of when you see changes in skin color, that is kind of weird, right? Darkening the skin, very physiological. Jaundice isn't, right? And jaundice gets kind of mistaken for keratin. Keratin right here, not keratin, keratine, right, is a yellowish orange pigmentation that we normally see in people who are overindulgent in certain foods. Now, I always use an example of, there's two examples of seeing this keratin and how it changes your skin color. First example is when we have babies, right? Up until about 6 months of age, maybe sometimes 7, 8 months, depending on which baby and how developed the baby is, right? Up until that point, when babies eat, they're drinking milk, right? They're not eating any solid foods. But about 6, 7 months, we start introducing solid foods. At first, it's just a little bit of, baby food, right? Very mushed up baby food. And baby's not going to love eating carrots. Not going to love eating broccoli and cauliflower at that point. So when you introduce it, sometimes we introduce the food with something that's sweet. Carrots. Carrots have a lot of carotene. And what happens is, right, baby eats a carrot, it's sweet, so they want to eat more. Mom's going to let the baby eat the whole can if she would, right? If the baby wants, because they're so excited. So what would happen then, right? Baby eating a jar of the baby food of carrots, right? Dad's been at work or mom's been at work and dad's taking care of baby, right? But the other spouse comes home and now he doesn't know. She doesn't know that the baby's been fed carrots. So dad wants baby to eat, right? The other parent comes home, they want to see the baby eat. So they feed the baby something sweet as well. Sweet potatoes, also high in carotene. Eventually, after a couple of days of this, carrots, right? And then followed up with sweet potatoes, then more carrots, and then more sweet potatoes, right? All of those vegetables have lots of carotene, right? After a week or maybe even 2 weeks of this increased amount of carrots and increased amount of sweet potatoes, what happens is baby starts to get orangey in color. The change in color is occurring, and then, the parents look and right away they know that there's something wrong. They think something's really wrong with the baby. They think it's jaundice, right? In reality, jaundice can be seen probably best at the sclera of your eye, the white of your eye, right? If you have true jaundice, your sclera, the white of your eye, will turn yellow. If you have keratinization from eating too much sweet potato, the skin will turn kind of orange color, but it doesn't affect the sclera. The sclera should be white, right? If the sclera is white, but the skin color is kind of reddish, yellowish, right? Orangish in color, then we know that there's really nothing wrong with the baby. We just have to decrease the amount of sweet potatoes and carrots we're giving the baby. Now, the second example that I always give is when in the 1970s and 80s, right? In America, we started this kind of experiment. They built this huge, huge building, and they're trying to figure out how long people can stay in that building, be self-sufficient without kind of going nuts. So the actual trial, right, experiment was supposed to last a year. People live in this place. It's like a dome-shaped building, right? It's in the middle of the desert, and they're going to live in it for a year with other scientists. I believe there's like 24 of them. And they're going to cook their own food. They can grow their own food. They're going to have all this food grown with them. They're going to have water that's going to be naturally made. And then they're going to see how long it takes, all right, before people kind of go stir crazy. What they found out was that, right, because of some kind of malfunction, all of the adults, all they could eat was sweet potatoes. And because all they could eat was sweet potatoes, there were pictures of reporters kind of trying to see what's going on inside the experiment. And all you would see are just orange colored people just walking around doing their daily task, right? What happened eventually was that there's a breakdown in one of the actual buildings and they had to stop the experiment. But if you ever look at pictures online, I think there's still pictures that shows just how orange that the actual participants of the trial were. Now, last thing we'll talk about is jaundice. Jaundice occurs due to yellowing of the integument and, more importantly, the sclera. What happens is this, right? We make 2 million red blood cells a second. We make 2 million red blood cells every second. If we make 2 million red blood cells a second, the one thing we need to do then is make sure that we get rid of 2 million red blood cells a second. So the bone marrow produces 2 million red blood cells a second. The spleen then takes up the red blood cells that are older and damaged. Remember, red blood cells, no nucleus, no organelles, so no repairs possible. As soon as a red blood cell gets old, it goes to the spleen destroys a red blood cell. Now, all the contents of the red blood cell can be reused. The iron in red blood cells brought to the bone marrow, reused to be reincorporated into new red blood cells. The globin chains, the proteins that are found in red blood cells, well, they're made out of amino acids. We can reuse those. The heme part of red blood cells is a chemical structure that helps support iron. That heme part gets turned into bilirubin in the spleen. Now, if we have a functional liver, the bilirubin then goes through the hepatic portal vein and goes into the liver. The liver takes the bilirubin and turns it into bile. Bile allows us to absorb fats, right? So that bile is useful, and we make it from some kind of, right, excess product that we call bilirubin. Now, in babies that have never had to use the liver before, because mom is doing everything. Mom's detoxifying drugs. Mom's doing everything, right, for the baby. So the liver, even in full-term babies, the liver has never been functional in utero. So now the baby's born, it no longer has mom to protect it, right? So it no longer has mom's immune system protected. It no longer has mom's liver to detoxify everything. So their baby's liver has to mature, even in a full-term baby. Well, what happens when the baby's born? They're still producing 2 million red blood cells a second. They're still having the spleen recycle 2 million red blood cells a second. They're still having lots of bilirubin that will be formed in the spleen by the recycling of the red blood cells. Now, in adults, the bilirubin goes to the liver and gets turned into bile. Well, in babies, infants, the liver has never worked before. So the bilirubin, right, increases in number because the liver can't take all that bilirubin and immediately turn it into bile. It's too immature. What happens then? Well, you're still producing 2 million red blood cells. You're still recycling 2 million red blood cells. You're producing a lot of bilirubin. Now the liver can't take that bilirubin and produce bile out of it, right? So there's a backlog of bilirubin. The bilirubin concentration increases in the bloodstream, and then it starts to seep out of the bloodstream into your integumentary system. And now you have that yellowing that we see, right? With people with jaundice, yellowing of the skin. You also see yellowing of the sclera, and that is the telltale sign of, in terms of, adults, right? Yellowing of the sclera, telltale sign of jaundice, and usually is caused by some kind of either a liver disease or a gallstone. Gallstones caused by little stones, calcium stones in the gallbladder. Well, those gallstones means that you can't release bile. So it builds up, right? And then you back up the bilirubin. And then people that have bad gallstones, right, will need to do surgery to remove it. But one of the signs that they have this pain is that their sclera becomes yellow. Now, people with damage to the liver will also see yellowing of the sclera. And that's a sign that they have liver change. The weird thing is this: you can have the most shriveled up, diseased liver in the world. And you can drink and drink and drink alcohol and drink your liver away through damage, right? Yet usually even at that point, since the liver doesn't have a lot of pain receptors, you don't have pain. So keep in mind that you can damage your liver without causing pain to it. Now, the painful part is when there's a problem with the gallbladder, right? I'm going to stop this one right here. And the next part 2 will include the dermis.